Italy, and the spark of the Renaissance. Imagine Europe in the 14th century, a continent scarred by war, famine, and the Black Death, which had claimed nearly 1/3 of its people. Villages lay in ruins, church bells fell silent, and faith in the old order began to crumble. Yet amid the ashes, in the northern cities of Italy, something extraordinary was beginning to stir. In Florence, Venice, and Milan, wealthy city-states built on trade and banking began to invest, not in armies or castles, but in art, knowledge, and human potential. The Medici family, powerful financiers of Florence, did more than hoard gold. They transformed it into fuel for creativity. They sponsored painters, sculptors, architects, and philosophers, planting the seeds of a new era, an age when humankind dared to believe it could reach the perfection once reserved for the divine. It was called the Renaissance, meaning rebirth. Not a rebirth of religion, but of reason, beauty, and faith in human ability. In workshops filled with the scent of oil paint, Leonardo da Vinci sketched the mysterious smile of the Mona Lisa. Michelangelo carved marble figures so lifelike they seemed to breathe. Brunelleschi raised the magnificent dome of Santa Maria del Fiore, a feat so bold that all of Europe looked up in awe. But the Renaissance was not only about paintings and sculptures, it was an age of daring questions. People began to ask, why does the earth move? Why are we born, and why do we die? They observed, experimented, and rewrote truths that had stood unquestioned for centuries. From those questions, modern science was born. If the Middle Ages were a long, dark night, then the Renaissance was a brilliant dawn, when the light of reason and art rose together. From Florence, that light spread across Europe, forever changing the way humanity saw the world and itself. It was the era when Europe rediscovered the power of the mind, and humankind, for the first time, learned to dream of the future. Great artists and their masterpieces. Amid the narrow streets of 15th-century Florence, where the sound of hammers mixed with church bells, Europe was preparing to enter one of the greatest eras in the history of art, the Renaissance, meaning rebirth. After centuries in the shadows of the Middle Ages, humanity began to lift its head, seeing the world not only through the lens of faith, but through the light of reason, knowledge, and beauty. This was an age when visionaries did not just dream, they transformed imagination into reality. In a small studio filled with the scent of oil paint and charcoal dust, Leonardo da Vinci meticulously sketched the curves of the human body, studying how muscles moved and stretched in motion. In his notebooks, beside the enigmatic smile of the Mona Lisa, lay designs for flying machines, submarines, and armored vehicles, inventions the world would not see for hundreds of years. Meanwhile, in a nearby workshop, Michelangelo stood before a massive block of white marble, hammer, and chisel in hand. After years of tireless labor, from that single stone emerged the figure of David, symbol of strength, courage, and the perfection of humankind. When the sculpture was unveiled, people said, Michelangelo did not create David, he merely freed him from the stone. Two men, a painter and a sculptor, together redefined the meaning of genius. For Leonardo, art was the science of seeing. For Michelangelo, it was the faith of form. Both believed that humanity stood at the center of the universe, and that perfection was not the gift of the divine, but the result of human hands and intellect. The Renaissance did more than give birth to masterpieces. It awakened the boundless potential of the human mind. From Florence, that flame spread across Europe, igniting Paris, London, Vienna, and eventually the entire world. Art, science, and philosophy were no longer divided. They merged into one, creating an age when humankind learned not only to think, but to imagine, to create, and to dream. That is the immortal legacy of the Renaissance, the era when humanity began not just to explore the world, but to discover itself. The printing press changes everything. Imagine living in 15th century Europe. There were no newspapers, no public libraries, no printed books. If you wanted to read, you had to be a king or a monk, because only they had access to the few precious manuscripts painstakingly copied by hand under candlelight. A single Bible could take a year to complete and cost as much as a house. As for most people, they couldn't read, not because they lacked curiosity, but because there was simply nothing to read. Then came a German goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg. who, with one simple yet revolutionary idea, changed the world forever. Around 1450, in his small workshop in Mainz, he built a strange new machine, the movable type printing press. Instead of writing each page by hand, Gutenberg cast individual metal letters, arranged them in frames, inked them, and pressed them onto paper using a mechanical screw. In just a few seconds, a perfect page appeared and could be reproduced hundreds, even thousands of times with identical precision. His first masterpiece, the Gutenberg Bible, was not only a triumph of faith but a symbol of a new age, the dawn of mass knowledge. For the first time, books could be produced faster, cheaper, and more accurately than ever before. And like wildfire, the idea spread. Within decades, hundreds of print shops sprang up across Europe. Knowledge, once locked inside monasteries and royal courts, was now being sold on the streets of Venice, Paris, and London. Printed pages began to reshape history. Thanks to the press, Martin Luther's 95 Theses spread across Germany within weeks, sparking the Reformation. Scientists like Copernicus, Galileo, and Kepler shared their discoveries with readers far beyond their homelands, paving the way for the scientific revolution. By the 18th century, the printed words of Voltaire and Rousseau ignited the Enlightenment, planting the seeds of democracy and human rights. And it all began with one man tired of copying letters by hand. That frustration gave birth to an invention that ushered humanity into an age of knowledge, freedom, and ideas. From the moment those metal letters pressed into paper, the world was never the same again. Science challenges old idea. For thousands of years, humanity looked up at the sky and believed that everything revolved around Earth. The sun rose and set. The stars shifted night after night. It seemed only natural to think we stood at the center of the universe, with all creation spinning around us. This idea, known as the geocentric model, was refined by Aristotle and Ptolemy, then elevated by the Church into unquestionable truth. And so, for more than 1,000 years, humankind lived in a cosmos where Earth and humanity ruled as the center of all things. Then, in the 16th century, a quiet scholar from Poland named Nicolaus Copernicus dared to ask a simple but radical question: what if it was all the other way around? In 1543, he published De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, on the revolutions of the celestial spheres. In it, Copernicus proposed that the Sun, not the Earth, was at the center of the universe, and that our planet was merely one of several orbiting around it. The idea seemed small, but its implications were enormous. It shattered the ancient illusion that humanity was the center of everything. For the first time, people began to see themselves not as the masters of the cosmos, but as part of something vast and humbling. A century later, Galileo Galilei pointed his crude telescope toward the heavens. He saw 4 moons orbiting Jupiter, and the changing phases of Venus, clear evidence that Copernicus had been right. But when Galileo publicly defended the heliocentric model, he saw more than just the stars. He saw the inside of a prison cell. Tried by the Church in 1633, he was forced to recant and spent the rest of his life under house arrest. Yet, as he left the court, he is said to have whispered the words that would echo through history: "Et pour si move." And yet, it moves. From that moment, a new age of science was born. Humanity realized that truth could no longer rest on faith alone, but on observation, evidence, and reason. The cosmic reversal sparked by Copernicus and Galileo didn't just transform astronomy, it transformed the human mind, paving the way for Kepler, Newton, and the entire scientific revolution that followed. The world no longer revolved around us, and in that newfound humility, humanity truly began to rise. From peering into the heavens with a small telescope, we would one day launch ourselves into the very cosmos we once believed revolved around us. Religious changes and the Reformation. In the early 16th century, Europe still lived under the enormous shadow of the Roman Catholic Church. From kings to common farmers, no one could escape its influence. The Church held not only spiritual authority, but also political power, wealth, and control over many parts of everyday life. It was not just a place of worship, it was a vast institution with land, treasures, and influence that often surpassed that of monarchs. Yet while church teachings spoke of humility and charity, reality told a different story. One troubling practice was the sale of indulgences documents that promised forgiveness in exchange for money. A German monk named Martin Luther could no longer accept this. On the 31st of October 1517, he walked to the door of the Wittenberg church, hammer in hand, and nailed up his 95 Theses, a long list of criticisms about corruption, spiritual abuse, and the urgent need for reform. What seemed like a simple act sparked a religious earthquake. Thanks to the recently invented Gutenberg printing press, Luther's ideas did not stay confined to one church. They spread across Europe within weeks, copied, debated, and passed from scholars and priests to everyday craftsmen. For the first time, ordinary people began asking, "Can we read the Bible ourselves and understand God in our own way?" From that question, a new era of faith was born. Supporters of Luther formed branches of Protestantism, Lutheran, Calvinist, Anabaptist, and more. These groups differed in doctrine, but they shared one conviction: they did not accept the authority of the Pope. In England, King Henry VIII even changed the country's entire religious identity so he could annul his marriage, creating the Independent Church of England. But such change came with a heavy price. Religious wars erupted across Europe, in Germany, France, Switzerland, the Netherlands, and beyond. Millions lost their lives, cities burned, and the continent was torn between two beliefs: Catholic and Protestant. At the same time, the Catholic Church launched its own reforms, known as the Counter-Reformation. It ended the sale of indulgences, improved clerical training, restored discipline, and rebuilt its influence through art, music, education, and new missionary orders such as the Jesuits. Despite the violence and turmoil, the Reformation opened the door to a new age, a time when individuals could choose their own beliefs. For the first time, people could read the Bible in their native languages, question religious authorities, and shape their faith personally. And from this shift in spiritual life came transformations in thinking and science as well. Once people dared to challenge sacred authority, they also learned to question the world around them. And just like Luther's hammer striking the church door, the door of history opened, and it never closed again. The birth of nations. In the 15th century, as Europe emerged from the shadows of the Middle Ages, a new hunger began to stir, a desire to see beyond the horizon. The young monarchs of Spain, Portugal, England, and France were no longer satisfied with guarding the lands they ruled. They dreamed of finding a path to gold, spices, and glory, inspired by the legendary tales of Marco Polo and the riches of the East that had fired imaginations for centuries. At the time, much of the world's geography was still a mystery. Many Europeans believed that beyond the Mediterranean lay the edge of the earth, where sea monsters waited and ships would fall into the abyss. But science and innovation began to banish those fears. The compass, the astrolabe, and the lateen-rigged sailing ship became the new tools of exploration, the first technologies of the Age of Discovery. Armed with these, kings placed the greatest gamble in human history, to send men across uncharted oceans. In 1488, Bartholomew Dias of Portugal became the first to round the Cape of Good Hope, unlocking the route to the Indian Ocean. A decade later, Vasco da Gama reached Calicut in India, bringing back pepper, cinnamon, and the promise of immense wealth. Not to be outdone, Spain funded an Italian sailor named Christopher Columbus, who in 1492 set foot on what he thought was Asia, but was in fact a new continent, the Americas. From that moment on, European flags began to spread across the globe. Cortés conquered the Aztec Empire, Pizarro subdued the Inca, and fleets bearing red and white sails crossed from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The world had never been so connected, but it had also never been so violent. Gold and silver poured from the Americas into Europe, building palaces and funding empires, but at a terrible cost. Disease and slavery wiped out millions of indigenous peoples. Sugar plantations, coffee fields, and silver mines in the New World were fueled by the forced labor of Africans, marking the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. Yet, this brutal age also reshaped the planet. Maize, potatoes, cacao, and tomatoes from the Americas became staples of global diets, while horses, cattle, and wheat from Europe transformed life across the Atlantic. Languages, religions, and cultures collided, sometimes merging, often clashing. to form the multicultural, interconnected world we know today. Born from ambition and curiosity, the Age of Discovery ushered in humanity's first era of globalization, when a single decision made in Lisbon or Seville could alter the lives of millions across an ocean. It was a world, vast, wealthy, and turbulent, one opened by those daring enough to sail past the edge of what everyone once believed was the very end of the earth.